Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us today. Next slide, please. Welcome to our webinar today, using Fidelity Scales for Evidence-Based Practices. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We're housed at Rutgers in the School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Kathy, and I'm the project coordinator of the center. We'll be introducing our webinar presenter for today. Next slide, please. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health workforce to deliver evidence-based and promising practices to individuals with mental health conditions. We also address the full continuum of services spanning mental illness prevention, treatment, and recovery supports. We also provide training-related workforces to police, first responders, primary care providers, vocational services, to provide effective services to people with mental health conditions. We also utilize supplemental funding to support school mental health. Next slide, please. We also offer training programs on evidence-based practices for serious mental health conditions, wellness and recovery for providers and people with mental health conditions, school mental health, comprehensive multi-tiered services and supports, Hispanic and Latina mental health education, as well as online education courses such as Wellness Matters, illness management and recovery, functional thinking, and more. We also want to remind you that all of our training programs, products, and services are available to you at no cost. Next slide. And if you're interested in staying up to date with our events and products that our center is providing, we ask that you please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up by hovering over the QR code that you see on your screen, and you can sign up directly on our website. Next slide. Following this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value your feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform our future activities and products. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of them. So we thank you in advance for your participation. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website within 7 days of this webinar broadcast. At the time of this presentation, Marian Delphin Rittman served as Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use at SAMHSA. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. We encourage you to interact with our presenter during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may post questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer them. As a reminder, the MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. This includes language that is strengths-based and hopeful, inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, healing-centered and trauma-responsive, invites individuals to participate in their own recovery journeys, language that is person-first and free of labels, is non-judgmental and avoids assumption, respectful, clear, and understandable, and consistent with our actions, policies, and products. As a reminder, SAMHSA has launched a 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline for people who are experiencing suicidal ideation, mental health, substance use and crisis, people who are experiencing emotional distress, or people concerned about someone in crisis. Now I will hand the webinar over to our presenter today, Sean Karzak. He is our Assistant Research Coordinator here at the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC. Welcome, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Appreciate it. So hi, everyone. My name is Sean Karzak. As Kathy said, at Rutgers, I am Assistant Research Coordinator. In my role on the MHTTC, I do a lot of the evaluations and help collect information about our training and technical assistance. And then I work to disseminate that to our team and try to send it out to our participants of our trainings. I also work with several other SAMHSA grants to try to help implement their programs and also doing evaluations as programs. I see we have some chat. I believe we have some bots in the chat, I think. So I apologize about that. So as I was saying, I work on some other SAMHSA grants to help implement their programs and evaluate their programs as well. Before joining, I worked in some supported housing programs. So let's get started today. So what are we doing today? So today we're going to talk about evidence-based practices. We're going to try to cover a little bit of a wide breadth about evidence-based practices. I'll talk about what they are and how services become evidence-based practices. I'll talk a little bit about why we should use them and what's the benefit. And then after that, we'll kind of transition a little bit. We'll talk about how you can find some information on them, talk about using some of the SAMHSA kits that are available. We'll talk about integrating those evidence-based practices into new or existing services. And then we'll talk a little bit about using Fidelity kits to make sure that we're matching up with what the prescribed key aspects of those practices are. So as I'm going through, I'm fine with you guys just raising your hand. We can unmute you, or feel free to use the chat to ask questions as we go along. So I guess before we get started, I just want to check in a little bit, and I wonder what you guys know about evidence-based practices. Have you worked in a modality with evidence-based practices, or have a program that you're thinking about implementing them in? Just give everyone a minute to enter into the chat. Okay, so maybe everyone's maybe a little bit new here for evidence-based practices, which is perfectly fine also. So hopefully we can cover some new stuff for you, and we'll, feel free to ask questions as we go along. I see Carolina says we require the nurtured heart approach as an evidence-based practice. Carolina, can you talk a little bit more about what the nurtured heart approach might be? So as Carolina might be typing in there, I'll just start with our slide here. So evidence-based practices or services, they've been shown to be effective at improving outcomes for the clients that we serve. And a lot of those evidence-based practices are informed by a few different things. So incorporating some clinical experience, client preferences, and also performing research to get to that evidence. So I'm seeing PJ saying that the nurtured heart is not an evidence-based approach, but a relationship tool. So we'll also talk a little bit about the differences between evidence-based, and then a lot of them are also called promising practices. So maybe they don't have quite the same evidence base, but are also considered best practices or promising practice. So I appreciate Caroline and PJ participating in the chat. So how do services become evidence-based practice, and how do we know that they're effective? So as I said in the previous slide, there's a few things that kind of are tied together. So first, a lot of the time it starts from this clinical experience and observing a practice. So performing a service in a way that has some good outcomes. And what about those services that work so well? And how can we repeat this in a positive way with more clients that we work with? So in order to test that further, we'll have to perform some research. So performing research helps us test those services, and the outcomes of these studies provides the evidence for the practice, hence evidence-based. And to best test them, we use randomized control trials to measure those effects. So randomized control trials, right, there's an intervention group and a control group. The intervention group will get that new practice and the control group won't. And then we measure the changes and see if there's any difference between them. If the intervention group is different, we kind of might be able to say that there is something going on with that practice they're using. And then to become really evidence-based, things need to be repeated over multiple studies. So we got to make sure that things are just not a one-off. And ideally, we use kind of the same intervention with different populations. So different ages, different genders, and different locations, maybe different diagnoses, and trying them over through different cultures as well. And then the last part we want to try to incorporate is client preferences. So a lot of the times we'll have person-centered services that are embedded into those evidence-based practices. So just to give you an example, like supported housing, we want to make sure that clients are getting a choice of housing options to select from. I say that, and I know right now, currently, housing is hard to get for any agency. So we'll talk a little bit about that too, that how those barriers might impact the practice, but just to give you guys an idea how that might be tied into them. So what are some of the established evidence-based practices and where can we find them? So SAMHSA lists some of these practices for people who are receiving mental health services or substance use disorder services. The ones they list are supported education, supported housing, supported employment, family psychoeducation, integrated treatment for co-occurring disorders, IMR services, and peer-provided services. And SAMHSA has these kits that discuss the evidence-based practices. And in each of these kits, they talk a little bit about the evidence that exists for it. So they kind of provide a little bit of a literature review. They talk about some of the key things to think about when you're providing those evidence-based practices. So that's would be particularly helpful for people who are doing new programs or trying to incorporate into existing programs. So things like staffing, resources that might be needed. And then they also include the Fidelity scale. So we're going to talk about that, but it helps us ensure that we're providing that practice, the way it was designed to be. And kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, that some practices may not quite meet that evidence-based title, but they might have positive outcomes in the research, but either there's just not enough evidence or there's kind of not enough stuff to make kind of a guideline for. So these practices are often called promising practices or best practice, which is kind of commonly used terminology even outside of our field, if you think about it. I was talking to someone about, a small housing project. I was trying to fix a sink, and the guy was like, "Oh, well, it's best practice to use this kind of tape around the pipes and things like that." So it's not just our kind of field that uses this terminology, right? So best practice is, the recommended way to do it. There's maybe a little subjectivity to that. Whereas if you're using those evidence-based practice kits, they try to make it very objective. So there's not as much interpretation and as far as that. So before I continue on, I just want to check in with everyone, see how everyone's doing. If anyone has any questions, if you're doing good, if you want to throw a smiley face or a thumbs up in the chat, just let me know how you're doing out there. Right, great. I'm seeing some smiley faces. That's good to see. Okay, so why should we use these evidence-based practices? So delivering evidence-based practices helps us as providers deliver high-quality care with some expected outcomes. And the practices are informed by evidence from multiple research studies to be effective. So we're not providing either new treatments or unproven services. So these would be, repeatable services and ideally similar across different providers and agencies, which I think is a big benefit. If you're a provider and you leave one place and go to another, whether that's a different agency or move to a different state, you kind of have a sense of what maybe to expect in your job or what's, expected of you. And also the same as goes for clients, right? If they go to a different agency or they move to a new area, they, they kind of have an idea of what maybe to expect out of the program. The studies show that evidence-based practices leads to higher quality of care, improved outcomes, reduced costs for the agency, which is always important. We're always on a tight budget at any agency. And then I think maybe most important is greater satisfaction as a provider than if you just, traditional care approaches, which I think is always good, right? All those things, clients get better outcomes, the agency's happy because they saving some costs, and then, providers are being more satisfied with the services they're delivering. And I think it would be, one thing to always know too is, as states move to fee for service, I know New Jersey's recently transitioned within the last couple of years. I think New York's been doing this for a bit longer, but as funders are requiring to be shown outcomes and positive outcomes and client satisfaction, all those things, they want to see evidence-based practices being done, and they want you to use services that have been shown to be effective. Okay, so now I'm going to transition a little bit, talk about how we can integrate our evidence-based practices into existing services. Now, just before I start, I just want to say that some of the stuff I'll go over is somewhat generalized. I've done some of this stuff where we implement these kind of programs in a new agency, and there's always kind of unique strengths and unique weaknesses, different barriers to overcome. Some have programs already in place, some are kind of starting over and new. So again, some of the stuff is kind of general, but just some things to think about as you might be trying to use some of these practices in your program. So those SAMHSA kits that I kind of alluded to before, they can help new programs, so they can help start a program kind of with that Fidelity checklist in mind, kind of knowing the answers and what you're shooting for, or kind of existing programs, help guide programs to a higher fidelity, or kind of know what they should be shaping their services towards. So I'm going to put the link in the chat for the website, so you know where to find some of these and that I'm referencing. Now, I will say they have been taking some down, putting some back up, moving things around, different links. So right now there is 3 of them on there. It seems like they took a few down. It's unclear if they're updating them. I've been kind of emailing them trying to find out. But I think they have the supported employment, the IDDT practice, and also there's one more on there. But so you have the links, so you can take a look and find them. And we'll look at that website also, actually. Let me pull it up now. I'm just going to stop share and pull up the website so we can kind of look at it together. So if you were to click on that link, it would bring you right to this page. And we can see that there's kind of a mix of evidence-based practice kits and also some of that best practice information. So their evidence-based practice kits are these ones with like these purple. Are they all purple? They are all purple kits. So I'm going to just click on one and show you how to access it. So this one's the for ACT programs. So click on it, it brings you to this page, tells you a little bit, and then if you click on this view resource, it brings you to an additional page here. On this page, they have all the kits and information in there under this download tab. And I'm going to briefly go over all of these, but we have how to use the evidence-based practice kit. So a real general overview of what's in it. How to get started with the evidence-based practices. So it tells you, defines that evidence-based practice, tells you a little bit about it. The building your program discusses the planning of evidence-based practice implementation for new programs, and also adaptations you might need to make for existing programs. Training frontline staff. So, what staff are needed for different elements of the program, how to train or hire staff, maybe what skills are needed to deliver that particular evidence-based practice. Then we have the evaluating your program. So this includes the Fidelity scales to evaluate that your program against the evidence-based practice kit, and also tells you a little about what the key elements are. Then we have the evidence, which is really like just a basic literature review, kind of telling you about it. And then we have these two brochures that are just, they have like multimedia and PowerPoint slides, which might be helpful if you're introducing it to different stakeholders or, trying to get some buy-in on, delivering the program. So I'll just check in again on how maybe what do you think about these kits? Have you used the kits or seen the kits before? How you think the kits might help you? As I just kind of pull up my slides back up. I apologize. The room that I'm in, the light's on a timer, which can be a little bit of a challenge. But has anyone ever used these evidence-based practice kits or thinking they might be helpful for you? Okay, see Heather says that she's reviewed them, but not implemented them yet. Okay, that's great. I think before you were to do, any implementation or anything like that, I think going through each and every part of these, they're kind of lengthy, but I think each one has individual information, but kind of overlapping also. They break up the information, but it repeats over it. They add to different things. So I think that's great that you've reviewed them. I think it's helpful to kind of go through. TJ says past organizations he's worked with did use these different practices. So that's great. So this is just another kind of overview of kind of some of that information I gave you about the different parts of it. But what I like about this is it kind of helps you see what people might find this information most helpful. If you look at the top, the getting started with evidence-based practices for agency administrators, program leaders, mental health authorities. So it kind of gives you an orientation on who might find each part of those kits most helpful. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about planning how those evidence-based practices may be implemented at your agency. Again, some of these may have already been thought about at your program. Some of these might have to be new things to think about. And this is not an exhaustive list. So if there's anything that you think that needs to be added on here, I'd be, be interested to know what you think might be also be helpful. But after I think reviewing those evidence-based practice kits, some of the things that you'll have to think about are, the needs of the service that you're going to be providing. How many clients will use it? How will it be received? Will people be going through and using it? Thinking about your staff, what staffing already exists in your program? What's some staffing that will be needed, and what are some of the qualifications that will be needed? Talking about location, right? So finding a good location for that new program. I always think about it when I worked at a supported housing program. We had one office that was like so far away from the community that, we were always concerned about, the price of gas and transportation, all those things. It would have been much better to have an office that was closer to the community. So I think that that's an important thing to think about, whatever the modality is, if it's easily accessible. Thinking about different services. So what services already exist at your agency? What might be some services that can be incorporated to or added onto to your new program? It's also important to think about funding. Unfortunately, that's always part of it. How are you going to fund the new staff or the new service? Importantly, also to think about the outcomes. So how are you going to collect that data to know that the service is doing what it's intended to do? Think sometimes that's might be easier than said than done to try to get the data that you need to know what's going on. And then I think it's also important to think about the barriers that you might face. As I said before, every program is kind of different, but trying to plan for what some of the foreseeable barriers and issues may be. Anytime you're doing a systems change, there'll always be pushback from staff or clients. This is how we've always done it. This is like something new. There's always that kind of challenge. All right, so just again, checking in is, has anyone seen these issues, trying to use new practices or, trying to do something different? There's either pushback or, issues that arise that might hinder a program or trying to do a new program. See, Ashley said yes, that it's so hard to get people on board, even with chasing the status quo. That's right. It's always a challenge trying to implement those new stuff. BJ says lots of issues for behavioral health agencies based on cost factors. Yeah, cost factors are always a challenge. That's probably one of the ones that are, most difficult to get around. You're constrained by what your funding is, who your funders are and what they're looking for. But yeah, I think trying to get through those barriers is probably the hardest part. You can have a great plan in place, think about all these things, and then, things just kind of break down once you try to implement them. There's strategies to be done. Sometimes some work better than others. I think the ones that seems to always be, effective is telling people how it's going to benefit them. We talked about those evidence-based practices and how it leads to greater client outcomes and, provider satisfaction. So I think going back to trying to tell people how it's going to be good for them. Again, easier said than done, but I think that that's usually one way to go or one way to start. Everyone wants to know what's in it for them. So I think if you can highlight those things, be helpful. So anyone else before we move on? Any other thoughts on challenges trying to implement a new program? Are you guys seeing my slides? I'm not sure what I ended up resharing.
John, we don't see your slide. We see the document. Evidence.
Oh, my notes. So everyone sees you. You're all seeing right behind the curtain.
And we also have one question in the Q&A pod.
Okay, Q&A pod. Can you speak to evidence-based practices versus evidence-informed? Yeah, so I think that the evidence-based practice is a little bit more stringent. I mean, if we think back to the list I had earlier about the evidence-based practices, which ones were, if you think about all the different modalities that there possibly is, there was only, I think, 7 or 8 on there, versus evidence informed, I think is how you worded it. But I think that's emerging practices. Sometimes things don't have a lot of evidence, like I said, has to go through different multiple randomized control trials, which anyone that's done research or read about research, it takes quite a long time to kind of get through. Again, things that hold it up are publication issues, funding issues to get funding for different research projects to redo them and retest them. Where I think evidence-based practices are at a point where there's enough evidence to say these are the different elements that are very important, and then there's enough evidence to say that it works effectively. I'm hoping that answered. It came up as anonymous, so I'm not sure who asked it, but feel free to throw a thumbs up or a smiley face if that helped answer that question. Or if you'd like me to elaborate more, feel free to let me know how I can be helpful. Seeing thumbs up, so okay, glad that was helpful. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Fidelity kits. I think that these are probably the most important part about the evidence-based practice process. And I think that this might be also part of that evidence-based versus evidence-informed, where there's enough evidence to actually say, this is how you can test for it. The Fidelity kits give a very detailed outline of the important ingredients, so to speak, to include in there. So the Fidelity kits help us assess if we're performing those evidence-based practices that are on par with the prescribed guidelines. And the goal of the Fidelity assessment is to help programs answer, does the program meet the principles of the IDEA model? Has the program achieved the expected results? So, those defined outcomes. And I think it's also important to note that the Fidelity scale, there's a gradient. I'll pull one up so you can look at it, but it's based on kind of the IDEA model. So, those real world situations, similar to that housing example, right? Like housing's hard to get. It's hard to give people different options of, housing that they can move into. So those real world situations hinder that perfect fidelity, right? There could also be barriers with different clients, staff and agency limitations, community pushback or availability of partner services. And there's also like legislation that can limit, the mental health services or funding. So, I've done a couple and I've never seen a program get a perfect score. And if there is, I'd love to see that program in action. So this is, to me, would be an ideal way that the Fidelity assessment works, right? And to think about that, the process is not meant to shame programs, which I think, if you're either working for a program or a kind of an outside person coming in to, do a Fidelity assessment, it's always met with backlash, right? Like, oh, you're coming in and assessing us. But I think if you take the approach that, The fidelity assessment is not meant to shame programs, but really inform them, tell them what's working, kind of what's not working, and, what areas might be improved upon, and what can be some things that we do to make them work. So PJ said, what's the highest score a program has achieved and what evidence base was used? What was the highest one achieved? I can't remember the highest score offhand. So the example I have is the supported housing, which we'll look at, and the highest score you can get is a 28. And anything below an 18 is considered like not following the best practice or not meeting the fidelity. So it was somewhere in the mid-20s, not quite as high as 28, which would be perfect, but above the 18. So kind of somewhere in there. And I think that, that's kind of a great place to strive. It's hard to, like I said, being perfect is, I don't know that any program would receive kind of a perfect score. It's kind of challenging to do. But if you're above where that cutoff is, I think that's a good place to be. But I think when we get down to the example, it'll be a little bit more helpful to see how it's scored also. So you can see where points can be kind of gained or lost. But I think the whole process overall is kind of a quality assurance and quality improvement. Again, diagnose those program strengths. I think it's important to, recognize staff achievements and the program achievements, right? It's not always good to always focus on the negative things. Focus on those areas of needs on the other hand, right? Identifying those problem areas and try to help formulate action plans to improve them. And in the end, really the goal is to help consumers or clients achieve their goals for recovery, right? So we want to improve those outcomes. And then I think also making the information available to either staff or clients or stakeholders, anyone that might think that it's, important to kind of go through, and also kind of, helps with that transparency so people know what's going on and helps people feel like they're part of the process too. So now let's talk about the scoring. So I think that this might help PJ. So this one's the supported housing example. And in the supported housing, there's two different areas that are kind of, they test with two different kind of scales. So the first one's this fidelity assessment. And then the second one is this general organizational index. And they're both kind of used together. They kind of collect different information. So I think used individually and collectively, they can be very helpful. But that fidelity assessment, they talk about how services are being provided. So helping to understand whether they're providing high fidelity services and if they're being faithful to the evidence-based model. And in the supported housing example, there's 7 different areas. For the most part, they're the same. There might be a little bit difference between which program, whether it's support housing or like support employment, how many areas there are, but they're all scored the same. So for each area, all the questions are kind of scored together. And then once you have all those subscales, all those averages are then added together. And then again, for this one, the perfect score is a 28. And then anything below that would be considered not meeting the fidelity. So you're kind of looking to score anything above an 18. Obviously higher would be better, but kind of anywhere in there is a good place to be. So if we look at the example, so we look at this 1.1a. So it's talking about clients choosing among different types of housing. So the examples they give are clean or sober housing, private landlord apartments. And then you can see where the scores are kind of come from. So to get a perfect score in this area, a 4, the client would have to have a choice of housing they prefer from a range of different options. But maybe that's not possible. Maybe that didn't happen. So maybe that program gets a 2.5, which they had kind of a choice, but not a whole lot of choices. So they had something to choose from, but it wasn't, kind of an endless choice. But sometimes that's not possible either. So maybe the person wasn't given a whole lot of different choices of different types of housing. And then in that case, they would get a 1. And if we look at 1.1b, talking about multiple units within that kind of modality, So to get a perfect score, they would have to be able to choose from a few different multiple units. But if they're kind of assigned a unit, then they're only given a 1. So I think you kind of get a little bit of an idea of kind of how they're scored. So these would be kind of averaged together. And then in the end, it would be added to the total score. And then similarly for this general organizational index, apologize. So it's talking about doing different assessments. And this is talking more about the outcomes, outcome measures of the program. Right, so this is talking about how many consumers receive those different assessments, and based on how many clients have received it, the program would have a higher score for this. So that was kind of a lot of information. So I want to just check in to see how everyone's doing, what questions you have about this. Do you see this potentially as a helpful tool? Can you see yourself using one of these, or maybe you think it's not so helpful? Just wondering what your thoughts are on these as I return to turn my light back on. PJ, I hope that this helped answer your question. PJ asked, is the Fidelity score listed on the SAMHSA site for each evidence-based practice? I think, well, not for each site. There's not like, or like someone that's providing it, there's not like, this program scored this, but each different evidence-based practice will have the scoring guide in there. Is that what you were getting at, PJ? Okay, yeah. So like if you're doing the ACT program, the scoring might be slightly different. I think it's similar, the same idea, right? There's a highest score that can be achieved and then kind of a cutoff point. But each of those Fidelity kits will have, those kind of outlined in there. Yeah, it actually would be interesting if there was like a central place where they had, okay, this program, Central New Jersey supported housing scored, 22 on their Fidelity. I guess kind of similar to some other accreditation approaches. So how's everyone else doing? Anyone else have any thoughts or ideas? Not thumbs up and smiley faces are helpful too. Seeing some faces and some thumbs up, so I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm going to continue on. If you have any other questions that come up about this, feel free to throw it in the chat or the question and answers, and I can get to them. Okay, so let's talk about, Heather asks, are there other sites to find evidence-based practices or best practices for behavioral health services? So I usually default to the SAMHSA site. Their kits are well-defined and laid out really nicely. I'm sure there is some other sites that might have some other or some other resources that are available. I'm not sure that they're as in-depth or laid out nearly as nicely as the kits from SAMHSA. But there's often ones for those kind of promising practices that are kind of scattered out there, right? Because those usually aren't as structured. So there might be some Fidelity scales or some informed, how would I word it, but like informed practice guides. I do think that the SAMHSA ones are really well made. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about how to plan to do a fidelity assessment. I think that this, or how to use the fidelity assessment, right? If you're doing a new program, trying to implement one, as you saw with those two examples on the scoring guide, you need kind of a lot of data to gather that information. Some of that can be found from client data, but you might also need to interview some clients to kind of find out some stuff that's not necessarily in the available from an EHR or client records. You'll also need some access to staff or access to administrators with knowledge of the program. So it's good to have a collaborative approach when you're doing the thing, because it's going to be hard to do those assessments, the fidelity assessment, if you don't have that information. So I think going in trying to be collaborative, again, trying to play up what's in it for them, right? You're going to go in, you're going to take a look, try to play up what's in it for them. It's going to be helpful because we're going to go in and evaluate it, and we're going to give you the information and try to target some areas that maybe we can work on. So you're going to collect the data from different sources, use all that different information to kind of create this picture of kind of what's happening with the program. Now, the scoring and evaluation, while it can be done with one person, it's really designed to be done with more than one person, kind of collaboratively. You might look at something and it when you're scoring things, it's a little subjective. So it's helpful to have someone else also going through and looking at the same things you're looking for or looking at. And then you can kind of meet, and discuss if there's discrepancies, kind of what you saw versus what the other person saw. And it just helps kind of increase reliability of your scoring. And then I think at the end, it's also very important to make those findings available to the program. Again, in the interest of making it collaborative and having everyone kind of on the same page and feeling a part of the process, making it available to stakeholders, so that might be staff or clients or the community as a whole. I think it's also important to remember why you're doing the assessment or why you're using evidence-based practices, right? You want to deliver better services. So it's important to offer successes and congrats for things they're doing well. Offer areas for improvement or, things that you're noting. And, try to offer some ideas or different solutions to try to, get better outcomes and, help the program run a little bit better. So on my last slide, we're doing pretty good here today with time. I have some questions. I met with other programs and have done a similar presentation before. And some of these are some questions that came up previously, and I thought they were really good questions. So I kind of wanted to include them, talk about them. So I think some of these questions actually you guys had asked before, so some of it might be a little duplicated, but again, I think it's helpful to think about what other people had, because maybe some of you had the same questions. But so what fidelity measures do we use? I think I talked a little bit about that. I mostly default to the SAMHSA kits because I think that they're well done. I put the link in the chat before. Again, there might be some more out there. I don't know if they're as well done as the SAMHSA ones. Another question I get sometimes is who measures fidelity, right? So in the SAMHSA kits themselves, they actually say that it can be used by evaluators, even stakeholders such as family members or other interested parties. So it really can be used by anyone. And some people ask, what's the level of knowledge you need to know? I think the kits outline things very well, so I think it's easy to kind of go through and know what you're looking for. But I think it's really helpful to have some, knowledge of whatever that evidence-based practice is that you're looking for. Because you'll know some of the ins and outs. If you've worked, like for me, I've worked in supported housing, so if I assess a supporting housing program, it's a little bit easier to know what's going on, know the lingo or the jargon, but it's not absolutely necessary, but definitely helpful. And again, using more than 2 people increases reliability, and I think makes it a little bit easier than just one person doing it. Another question I get is, how often is fidelity measured? So the kit suggests that it's done, if you're starting a new program within the first 2 years, doing it every 6 months, and then doing a follow-up, check once a year. In my experience, I don't know that's done nearly that often. Again, I think it's a challenge to have someone come in and go through it and organize all that data and have clients and staff and administrators available. So all those things kind of get in the way of, making it done as often. I think it's helpful to do it often, but there's also those challenges. And I think part of it too is that program like vulnerability. If it's someone from the outside coming in, even if it's someone, internal too, nobody ever wants to do those yearly reports or whenever your funders come in to look at all your data and your outcomes. You don't want anyone uncovering anything that maybe would look bad. But I think reframing the process again as we're coming in to try to take a look at it. We want to know what's good, what's bad, and let's make a plan to try to work on things that aren't going great. Another question I get is the evidence-based practice kits used to guide implementation? So this was really for new programs. So again, I think part of that stuff gives information on new programs and helps define what's absolutely necessary to include, and is really a good guide. And then a last question I get is, are staff specifically trained to implement those evidence-based practices? So the staff that are working in those programs. And I just default that the kit also has some recommended roles, education, what kind of training they might need. So it's helpful to know kind of, when you're evaluating what staff do we have and do we need to hire anyone else? They give a good outline of what might be helpful or who you should kind of include. So I see Ashley typed in, never heard of an evidence-based practice kit, but our quality and fidelity teams help make sure that we're doing that. We're not recently looking at what we can do to better measure outcomes. Yeah, so I think it's great that you are recently, yes. Yeah, I think that the kits can be helpful in guiding it. And if there's not a kit available for whatever the practice is, I think, thinking about what are the important things that we're trying to do. What are the important outcomes that we want to get to? What does the research say? And I think even just making a plan like this is things that we need to look at, and these are things that the outcomes we want to get to. I think that's having a good plan in the beginning, kind of going in and what's the bar we want to set for ourselves and kind of get to and work from there. But I think it's exciting, Ashley, that your agency has a quality and fidelity team that is focused on that. That's great. So I know we're getting towards the end, and I want to leave Kati a few minutes at the end, but does anyone else have any other questions or thoughts or comments? Just want to say appreciate everyone, putting their questions in the chat. Again, even the thumbs up and the smiley faces are also helpful to know how everyone's doing.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for your active participation during our webinar. We're very pleased to see that so many people have tuned in and are actively responding in the chat, whether it's through an emoji or just specific questions, we're happy to have your participation, especially on this topic. I did receive a couple of questions regarding the recording and the posting of this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website within 7 days, and everyone will receive a certificate of completion. On your screen, you do see our evaluation QR code. As part of the SAMHSA funded program, we are required to evaluate all of our products and services and events. You can either access the evaluation through the QR code, or you can also click on the link that I have provided in the chat box in order to complete our short evaluation survey. Next slide, please. We also invite you to check out our podcast channel, Toward Wellness and Recovery. We are featuring a Flourishing at Work, a plan for helping professionals. It's a podcast series. You can either find it on Spotify, Apple Music, or Podbean. Next slide, please. And just in case you wanted to access a previous webinar that we hosted, you may do so by going on our website and clicking under the products and resource catalog, and or you can also scan the QR code in order to access that website. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, all certificates of completion will be sent to everyone who has joined us today for this webinar, and that will be available within 7 days as well. We invite you to follow us on our various social media outlets. We are in Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn at the handles that you see on your screen. I just wanted to thank Sean again for providing us with this webinar. Sean, do you have any final comments for our attendees?
No, I just want to say thank you for everyone for your participation. And if anyone has any other questions, I'm just going to put my email in the chat. So if you can, that's not helpful. Spelt it wrong. There we go. So if anyone has any additional thoughts or questions, feel free to reach out to me. And again, thank you everyone for coming and listening and your participation. Hopefully you all got something out of it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again on our future events. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.